There is a country on Earth where the average person carries DNA from 4 different continents, where a man in Georgia can share more ancestry with someone in West Africa than with his neighbour 2 streets over, where a woman in New Mexico carries a genetic signature that traces back 20,000 years to people who walked across a land bridge from Siberia, and another signature that arrived on a slave ship 300 years ago, and another that came with a Spanish soldier in 1540. One country, one flag, and underneath it a genetic story so violent and so layered and so strange that when scientists finally mapped it in full, they described it as unlike anything else in the recorded history of human migration. Not the most complex in the Americas, not the most complex in the Western Hemisphere, unlike anything else, anywhere. This is not a story about race. Race is a social category. This is a story about what actually happened, written in the genomes of the living and the dead, across 20,000 years of arrivals, collisions, and survival. And the answer is far darker, far stranger, and ultimately far more moving than the version most people were taught in school. The continent did not start with Europeans. That much everyone knows in theory. But the genetic reality of who the first Americans actually were, where they came from, and what happened to them is still being rewritten by ancient DNA, and the picture emerging is one of almost impossible complexity. Around 20,000 years ago, a group of people living in what is now northeastern Siberia began moving east. They were not a single tribe. They were a population that had itself been mixing for thousands of years, carrying ancestry from ancient North Asian lineages and from a ghost population that geneticists now call ancient North Eurasians, a group so old and so distinct that their closest living relatives today are found not in Asia but in parts of Europe. These people crossed into the Americas either across the Bering Land Bridge, which was not a narrow crossing, but a vast grassland subcontinent hundreds of miles wide, or along the Pacific coastline in boats, or both. Nobody knows exactly. The trail is that old. What they brought with them was a genetic signature that does not exist anywhere else on Earth. It formed in isolation during the crossing and the early millennia of settlement, shaped by the particular ancestors who made it and by the bottleneck of the crossing itself, which filtered the genetic pool down to a relatively small founding group. By the time Europeans arrived in 1492, that founding signature had diversified into hundreds of distinct populations spread across 2 continents, from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, each one carrying its own local variation, built on that shared ancient foundation. The genetic distance between some Native American groups is greater than the distance between Europeans and East Asians. Think about what that means. 2 continents of diversity, 15,000 years of divergence, hundreds of languages, thousands of cultural traditions, all of it rooted in a single founding migration that crossed a frozen corridor at the edge of the world. And then, in the space of roughly 150 years after 1492, somewhere between 50 and 90% of that entire population was gone. The numbers are still debated. Some estimates place the pre-contact population of the Americas at 60 million people. Some go higher. By 1600, the population of the same landmass had been reduced to a fraction of that. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, diseases for which the immune systems of people who had been isolated from Eurasian livestock for 15,000 years had no preparation. Villages that had stood for centuries emptied in seasons. Entire language families vanished without a single speaker surviving to pass them on. When the first English settlers arrived at Jamestown in 1607, they were not landing in a pristine wilderness. They were walking into the aftermath of a catastrophe so total that the forests had grown back over abandoned fields. The deer had returned to cleared land, and the silence they took for emptiness was actually the echo of a world that had just ended. That silence is the first layer of the American genome. It is still there. In the DNA of roughly 2 to 3% of people who identify as white Americans, geneticists find small but unmistakable traces of Native American ancestry. In people who identify as Black Americans, the percentage is higher, around 4% on average, a record of contact and mixture that happened at the edges of colonial society, in frontier communities, in the spaces where written records were not kept. And in people who identify as Hispanic or Latino, the Native American signal is often the largest component of all, a direct line back to the civilizations that were already here before Columbus sailed. The first layer was never erased, it was buried, and the DNA found it. The second layer arrived in chains. Between 1619 and 1808, when the international slave trade to the United States was legally abolished, somewhere between 388,000 and 500,000 enslaved people were brought directly to North America from the African continent. That number sounds precise. It is not. Hundreds of thousands of individual human beings passed through the Middle Passage and into American ports, and the records of exactly who they were, where they came from, and what happened to their descendants are fragmentary, incomplete, and in many cases deliberately destroyed. What ancient DNA and modern genetic analysis have been able to recover from that silence is extraordinary and heartbreaking in equal measure. The majority of enslaved Africans brought to what would become the United States came from a relatively narrow band of the West African coast, primarily from the regions now known as Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, with significant contributions from Angola and Benin. The Yoruba, the Igbo, the Akan, the Wolof, the Bakongo, peoples with rich and distinct genetic histories stretching back thousands of years, were thrown together in the holds of ships, forced into proximity and labour, and eventually into families, and their genes began to mix in ways that had never happened before in West Africa itself. The African American genome that exists today is not simply West African. It is a new genetic population, one that formed entirely within the last 400 years, carrying a mosaic of West and Central African lineages, blended by the particular horror of the slave trade's geography, and by centuries of forced and voluntary mixing that followed. And here is the part that the genetics makes impossible to look away from. The average African American carries roughly 24% European ancestry, 1/4. That ancestry did not arrive through immigration or intermarriage in the modern sense. The vast majority of it entered the African American genome during the period of enslavement, through assault, through coercion, through the systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white enslavers. The DNA is not neutral, it is a record. Every percentage point of European ancestry in the average African American genome is a data point in a history of violence that left no other written record. The genetic signal outlasted the silence. It outlasted the euphemisms. It outlasted every attempt to bury what happened in a language clean enough to teach in schools. The bones remembered, the chromosomes kept the account. The third layer is European, and it is itself far more complicated than the word European suggests. The people who colonized North America did not come from a single place or a single genetic tradition. The English settlers of the Atlantic seaboard carried the genetic signature of a population that had itself been layered over thousands of years. Bronze Age farmers over Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Roman-era migrations over Bronze Age populations, Viking and Norman arrivals over all of that. The Scots-Irish who flooded into the Appalachian backcountry in the 18th century carried a different genetic profile than the Puritans of Massachusetts, who carried a different profile than the Dutch of New York, who carried a different profile than the French Huguenots of South Carolina. And these were only the early arrivals. Between 1820 and 1920, approximately 33 million people immigrated to the United States from Europe alone. Irish fleeing famine, Italians leaving poverty and land scarcity, Jews escaping pogroms in the Russian Empire, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Greeks, Armenians, Swedes, Norwegians, Germans, each wave carrying its own genetic history accumulated over millennia in their homelands, each wave landing in a country that was simultaneously absorbing all the others. The genetic map of white Americans today reflects not just this diversity, but the particular patterns of where people settled and who they married. In the South, the genetic signature of the original English and Scots-Irish settlers is still visible in measurable ways, preserved by geographic isolation and strong cultural pressures toward endogamy within communities. In the urban Northeast, the mixing of Irish, Italian, Jewish and Eastern European ancestry created a genetic profile unlike anything that existed in Europe itself. A new population formed by proximity and the particular social dynamics of American city life. In the Midwest, Scandinavian and German ancestry dominates in ways that still show up clearly in genome-wide studies. The country that thinks of itself as a melting pot is genetically more like a mosaic, regions that blended intensely within themselves while remaining surprisingly distinct from each other. But the layer that most complicates the simple European story is the one that runs beneath it and through it and around it, connecting the European genetic signal to the African genetic signal in ways that the social categories of American history were designed to prevent anyone from seeing. The one-drop rule, the legal fiction that defined anyone with any African ancestry as black, regardless of appearance or self-identification, was not just a social policy. It was a genetic sorting mechanism. It forced people into categories and then forced those categories to breed within themselves, creating a kind of artificial genetic isolation that the DNA has now dissolved. Studies of DNA from people who identify as white Americans in the South consistently find African ancestry at rates between 3 and 12%, not in a few individuals, as a consistent background signal across large populations. The mixing that the law forbade and the culture denied happened anyway, quietly, across generations, and the genome kept the record while the courthouse burned it. The fourth layer is the most recent, and in some ways the most genetically dramatic. The Immigration Act of 1965 eliminated the national origin quotas that had governed American immigration since the 1920s. Quotas explicitly designed to preserve the Northern European genetic character of the country's population. The result was a transformation in the origin of immigrants that was so large and so fast that its full genetic consequences are still unfolding. Between 1965 and 2015, the United States absorbed approximately 59 million immigrants. The majority came not from Europe, but from Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Mexican, Guatemalan, and Salvadoran immigrants carrying their own complex genetic heritage of Native American, Spanish, and African ancestry. Chinese, Korean, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese immigrants carrying lineages that stretch back tens of thousands of years into the genetic history of Asia. Nigerian, Ethiopian, Ghanaian, Somali immigrants carrying the deepest genetic diversity on Earth, because Africa is where the human species spent the vast majority of its existence before anyone left. Each of these populations brought genetic signatures that had never existed in North America before, except in the case of the Asian lineages, which echo faintly in the Native American genome as a reminder that the first Americans and the recent Asian immigrants share a common ancestor who lived in northeastern Siberia 20,000 years ago. The circle closes in the DNA even when it does not close in the history books. What makes the American genome unlike anything else on Earth is not just the diversity of its components. It is the speed at which they have been mixing. In most of the world, genetic populations mix slowly, over centuries and millennia, through the gradual contact of neighbouring groups. In the United States, populations that had been separated by oceans and mountain ranges and thousands of years of divergent evolution were placed in proximity within the span of a single lifetime. The Irish Catholic arriving in Boston in 1847 was genetically as different from the freed slave arriving in the same city from South Carolina as two populations on the same continent can be. Their grandchildren went to school together. Their great-grandchildren sometimes married each other. The genetic distance that took 50,000 years to accumulate between Africa and Europe began to close in 3 generations in the tenements of American cities. The data on intermarriage in the United States makes this concrete in a way that is almost dizzying. In 1970, roughly 1 in 100 marriages in the United States was between people of different racial backgrounds, as defined by the census. By 2015, that number was 1 in 6. Among people under 30, it was closer to 1 in 4. The genetic consequences of this shift have not yet fully appeared in population-level data, because many of the children and grandchildren of these marriages are still young. But the trajectory is clear. The American genome is converging. Not toward uniformity, not toward a single blended population, but toward a level of within-population diversity that has no precedent in recorded human history. The most genetically diverse country on Earth is in the process of becoming more diverse still, not by adding new populations, but by mixing the ones it already has. And yet the mixing is not uniform. It never is. The genetic geography of the United States still reflects the violence and the policy and the accident of its history. The concentration of African American ancestry in the South and in specific northern cities reflects the particular geography of slavery and the Great Migration. The concentration of Native American ancestry in the Southwest and in Oklahoma reflects the particular geography of dispossession and the reservation system. The concentration of Asian ancestry on the West Coast reflects the geography of the trans-Pacific immigration routes. The United States is not one genetic story. It is 50 of them, layered on top of each other and running through each other, each one carrying the marks of a specific history that played out in a specific place. There is a detail from a 2020 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics that has stayed with me since I first read it. Researchers analysed the genomes of more than 32,000 Americans who identified as white and found that roughly 3.5% of them carried more than 2% African ancestry. By current population estimates, that translates to approximately 7 million Americans who identify as white but carry a measurable African genetic signal, almost certainly inherited from an ancestor who passed as white at some point in American history, whose African ancestry was concealed or forgotten or simply never spoken of. 7 million people, walking around with a history in their DNA that their family never told them. The genome does not forget, even when the family does. The genome does not respect the categories that were built to contain it. It flows where the bodies went, across the lines that the law drew and the church enforced and the culture maintained. And when you sequence it, all of it comes out. The plantation owner and the enslaved woman, the Cherokee grandmother and the colonial grandfather, the Irish immigrant and the freed man in the city neighborhood where no history book recorded that they lived side by side. All of it is still there, carrying forward in the bodies of people who may have no idea it exists. That is what America is, written in nucleotides rather than in the documents that were supposed to define it. Not a nation of a single people, or even of many peoples living side by side. A nation of people who are, at the genetic level, already each other, already mixed, already carrying in their own bodies the evidence of every encounter, every violence, every love, every crossing, every survival that built this place. The story that most Americans were taught was about arrivals and origins, about who came from where and what they brought with them. The genetic story is about what happened after the arriving, in the spaces between the official histories, in the generations that the records did not capture. It is a story still being written. The mixing that began 20,000 years ago, when the first humans crossed into an empty continent, has not stopped. It has accelerated. And the country that results from it, the country that is already here in the genomes of its people, even if it has not yet arrived in its politics or its self-understanding, is something the world has genuinely never seen before. One country, every genome. The whole human story compressed into 400 years and still unfinished.